Hey everyone, Dr. D here, and in this video we are going to be covering Chapter 2 from our Campbell Biology 12th edition. So let's go ahead and get started.
Dr. D, 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 Dr. D. Explain stuff.
Now you may be wondering, why are we learning chemistry, which is the topic of Chapter 2, the chemical context of life? Why are we learning chemistry in a biology class? And that's a good question. The answer is really in that Biology for Science Majors 1, Biology 1406 for my students is essentially a cell biology class. This means that we are going to be studying things that are no bigger than a cell. We are really interested in how the functional unit of a cell works, right? So remember that the cell is the basic unit of life, and all living things are made up of at least one cell. So if you understand how a cell works, then you'll understand how pretty much all life works, because life is based on the basic unit of life, which is a cell. Okay, so this is why, just as a prelude, this is why we're learning about chemistry, because think about what's happening inside of a cell. You've got these organelles like the mitochondria, the chloroplast, the nucleus, DNA, and all of these are based on molecular interactions that make them work. So if you want to understand how these organelles work, and how the molecules work inside, and how the proteins interact with one another, and how DNA works, and how RNA works, well, then you really need to know your chemistry. You need to understand molecular bonds. You need to understand molecular interactions. And this is why we're studying chemistry in Chapter 2. So believe me, it is important that you understand these concepts from Chapter 2. It will make the rest of the semester that much easier. So let's dive right into Chapter 2, the chemical context of life. And the basics of chemistry are that everything is made up of matter. Organisms are also made up of matter. Matter is anything that takes up space and has mass. And if you want to know what makes up matter, just think of the periodic table of elements. The periodic table of elements, this is what makes up matter. Matter is made up of the elements. If you have an absence of matter, by the way, that's a vacuum. So think of the vacuum of space, outer space, where there is no air. Because even air is matter, right? So when you're flailing your arms around, you're going through matter. You're going through oxygen. You're going through nitrogen. You're going through carbon dioxide and other gases, right? So this is matter. The opposite of matter would be a vacuum, the absence of any substance. So what is an element? Remember the periodic table of elements. You got hydrogen, helium, lithium, boron, beryllium, boron, etc. An element is a substance that cannot be broken down to other substances by chemical reactions. Okay, so those are the elements that as they appear on the periodic table of elements. What is a compound then? A compound is a substance consisting of two or more elements, but they have to be in a fixed ratio. Think of sodium chloride, right? NaCl as a great example of a compound. And when compounds form, what you should know is that when a compound forms, it has characteristics that are different from its individual elements that comprise the compound. This is a type of emergent property. Remember, we learned about emergent properties in Chapter 1, that these traits appear that are greater than the sum of the parts. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Here's the compound I'm talking about. Sodium chloride, table salt. This is the yummy substance that you sprinkle on your French fries to make them tasty. Okay, but what is this yummy substance comprised of? It's comprised of sodium and chlorine. So let's take a look at sodium, pure sodium, and Chlorine, pure chlorine. Sodium, did you know that sodium is a metal? It is a metal that is quite reactive. Did you know if you throw sodium metal into water, it starts popping, it starts kind of exploding. Okay, so it violently reacts with water. So it's kind of a very highly reactive exploding metal when added to water. Okay, so this is sodium. Chlorine exists as a gas. Okay, chlorine is a gas, and not only is it a gas, but it is a toxic, hazardous gas. You do not want to breathe chlorine gas. Okay, it is quite poisonous. But look at this: when sodium reacts with chlorine to form the compound sodium chloride, it becomes a yummy table salt. So the yummy table salt is an emergent property, is it not? It is different than the sum of its parts. An explosive metal and a toxic gas come together to form a yummy seasoning. So this is an emergent property of this compound. And compounds have these emergent properties that are different than the sum of the individual elements that make them up. Now, on the periodic table of elements, 92 are natural elements. And of those 92 elements, 20 to 25% are required for life. These are known as essential elements for life. And of those elements, only 4. Hi, Wicket. There's Wicket in the background. Only 4 make up 96% of living matter: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. These 4 elements alone make up 96% of your body. They make up 96% of the living matter on the earth. Most of the remaining 4% consist of calcium, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. There are some elements that are required in minute quantities, tiny quantities. These are known as the trace elements. For example, do you guys know that you need iron in your blood, right? Everyone knows that you have iron in your blood. Well, iron is a trace element. It is required in relatively minute quantities. Here we can see the elements in the human body. And do you remember just these 4 elements: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen? Those 4 elements alone make up 96% of the human body. And why is that? Well, we're going to learn this in the next chapter, but these are the elements that are found in your biomolecules, your proteins, your carbohydrates, your lipids, and your DNA and your RNA, the nucleic acids. Next, we have calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium. This is what rounds out the rest of the approximately 4% of your human body. But do you remember there's also a host of those trace elements that you only need in minute quantities? These include boron, chromium, copper, iodine, iron. I'm not going to list them all, but these are elements that your body requires in tiny amounts. This is why they're called trace elements. Now, each element consists of unique atoms. An atom is the smallest unit of matter that still retains the properties of an element. Think of an atom as an individual piece of an element. And a molecule, then, is a group of atoms bonded together. And what is an atom comprised of? Atoms are actually made up of smaller parts called subatomic particles. And there are 3 main subatomic particles. There are neutrons, which have no electrical charge. There are protons, which have a positive charge. and the tiny electrons, which have a negative charge. These are the three subatomic particles that make up atoms. Now, near the center of each atom, there is what's known as the atomic nucleus. This is where the neutrons and the protons lie. The neutrons and the protons have a mass of what's called a Dalton. Both neutrons and protons weigh about a Dalton. The Dalton is the mass of an individual proton or neutron. Now, electrons, they don't exist in the atomic nucleus. Instead, electrons form a cloud of negative charge around the nucleus, and those electrons spend time in these clouds, most of their time in these clouds. We'll talk about this in a minute. And electrons, they don't have a mass of a Dalton. They are so small compared to a neutron or a proton that they are ignored. Their mass is largely ignored when calculating the total mass of an atom. In fact, an electron is about 2,000 times smaller than either a neutron or a proton. Electrons are tiny. Here is a simplified model of what helium, the element helium, looks like. Here's an atom of helium depicted two different ways. On the left, you see that helium, in its atomic nucleus here in the center, has two positively charged protons and two neutral in charge neutrons. Notice how they drew the neutrons and the protons roughly the same size. That makes sense, remember, because the protons and the neutrons have the same mass, so they are the same size. And so this would be a 4 Dalton atomic nucleus. And then the electrons, remember, the electrons are so small that you wouldn't be able to see them because they would be 2,000 times smaller than these protons or neutrons. And those electrons exist anywhere in this cloud. And helium has 2 electrons. In the model on the right, you can see how many electrons helium has. Helium has 2 electrons. So here you can see that there's 2 electrons that live in this cloud. Now, one more very important thing about atoms I need to share with you. An atom, as it appears on the periodic table of elements, by definition, an atom has the same number of protons as it does electrons. This is because an atom doesn't have an overall net charge. For an element to not have an overall net charge, each positive charge of a proton needs to be canceled out by a negative charge of an electron. Does that make sense? So atoms on the periodic table and atoms in general have no charge. Why would they have no charge? Well, that means no net charge. For every positive proton, an atom has a negatively charged electron. So if helium atom has 2 protons, helium atom must also have 2 electrons. So just remember that. It's very important that you remember that atoms are neutral in charge. That means they have the same number of protons as they do electrons. Now, atoms of the various elements differ in the number of their subatomic particles. So, have you ever seen the periodic table of elements? Have you ever looked at an individual element? Let's take carbon, for instance. The smaller number is known as the atomic number. This is the number of protons in the atomic nucleus of that atom. Okay, the smaller number is the atomic number. It is the number of protons. And by the way, the periodic table of elements is arranged by increasing numbers of atomic number of protons, with hydrogen at the top left having 1 proton and helium at the top right having 2 protons. And then if we go to the next row, kind of like you're reading a book, if we go to the next row, you have lithium with 3 protons. Its atomic number is 3. You have right next to it beryllium with 4 protons. Its atomic number is 4. And then you have boron with 5. And then carbon with 6. Nitrogen with 7. Oxygen with 8. Fluorine with 9. And finally neon with 10. You see how it works? The periodic table of elements is arranged with elements in increasing atomic number from left to right, from top to bottom. And that's what identifies an element. I want to share with you that carbon has 6 protons. No other element has 6 protons. So by definition, you can identify an atom based on the number of protons it has. If the element has 6 protons, it is carbon, period, the end. Okay? There's no other element that would have any business having 6 protons. Carbon can have strange numbers of neutrons and still be carbon. Carbon can have strange numbers of electrons and still be carbon. But carbon cannot have anything other than 6 protons and be carbon. This is why we know that the atomic number is the number that's used to identify an element. I hope that makes sense. Let's carry on. So what is the larger number on the periodic table? When you look at that chemical symbol, the larger number is known as the mass number. And it's a little tricky because it's the sum of the protons plus the neutrons in the nucleus. So again, if we look at carbon, remember the atomic number is 6, which means that's the number of protons it has. But the larger mass number is 12 in regular carbon 12. The larger number is 12. But remember, that doesn't mean carbon has 12 neutrons, because 12 is the sum of the protons plus the neutrons. Therefore, you have to subtract the number of protons, the atomic number, from the mass number, the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. So how many neutrons does carbon possess? The answer is 12 minus 6, or 6. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Again, the atomic number is the number of protons, and the mass number is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons in that nucleus. Now, the atomic mass is the atom's total mass, which is not just the number of protons and the number of neutrons, which is the mass number, but that also includes the mass of the electrons. But remember, I told you that the electrons are so teeny tiny. They are 2,000 times smaller than an individual proton or a neutron, so that it's negligible. It doesn't even matter. It can be approximate. The atomic mass can be approximated by just looking at the mass number. The mass of the electrons really doesn't add that much. Now, one more thing I want to share with you that is really fascinating is that the atomic nucleus makes up most of the mass of the atom. However, the electron cloud, you know where the electrons live in this cloud, that takes up most of the space of an atom. Do you see what I'm talking about? The protons and the neutrons are massive. They're in the center of the atom. However, the electrons are tiny, but they take up so much space. So let me explain how this works. Imagine if the protons and the neutrons, the atomic nucleus, was the size of this pencil eraser right here. You see right in my hand, I have this pencil eraser. And this is the mass of the protons and the neutrons. So you're looking at the protons and the neutrons of a typical element. Then imagine if I took this pencil eraser and I placed it in the center of Cowboys Stadium, okay? Now, bear with me here. Now I place the eraser in the 50-yard line of Cowboy Stadium. Guess how much space the electron cloud takes up with those tiny electrons. And by the way, you wouldn't even be able to see those tiny electrons because they would be 2,000 times smaller than my little pencil eraser here. Well, guess what? Those electrons would be buzzing around in this cloud, and the cloud would take up the rest of that Cowboy Stadium. Isn't that interesting? So think about that. If you saw an atom the size of Cowboy Stadium coming at you, it's like a giant atom the size of Cowboy Stadium, and it's coming right at you. Do you know what you would see? You wouldn't see hardly anything, actually. You would just see this little pencil eraser 50 yards away. That is an atom. So think about this for a second. An atom is almost entirely empty space, isn't it? Because think about it. If an atom, the size of Cowboy Stadium, all you can see if you squint really hard is a little pencil eraser, which is the mass of the atomic nucleus. That means most of the atom is just empty space. Isn't that fascinating? Most of matter is empty space. Most of an atom is empty space. This is why when you go and you need an X-ray done, they shoot X-rays through your body. Those X-rays go through your body, never having hit anything, and they come out the other side and get developed on that X-ray film. Is that not fascinating? Those X-rays travel right through your body and don't touch a thing. And your bones appear brighter, and this is because your bones are more dense and your bones absorb more of the X-rays. Isn't that interesting? So the bones absorb the X-rays because they are more dense, but the X-rays pass right through your soft tissues and your organs. Is that not fascinating? And that's because you are mostly empty space. So everything is made up of mostly empty space. Now, all atoms of a particular element have the same number of protons. For instance, carbon always has 6 protons. However, the number of neutrons can actually vary. So for example, there is carbon 12, which has 6 neutrons, carbon 13, which has 7 neutrons, and carbon 14 has 8 neutrons. And these elements that have different numbers of neutrons are called isotopes. So carbon 12, 13, and 14 are isotopes. They are atoms that have different numbers of neutrons. And sometimes this causes problems. This can lead to radioactive isotopes. Some of these isotopes are radioactive. They decay spontaneously, and as they decay, they give off particles and energy. And eventually, radioactive isotopes break apart. They decay. A parent isotope decays into its daughter isotope at a fixed rate. This rate is known as the half-life of the isotope. So different radioactive elements have different half-lives. Some range in the number of days or weeks, and some can range into thousands of years, depending on the element that's radioactive. And the reason why elements become radioactive is because the number of neutrons and protons in the atomic nucleus, if they're not in the correct ratio, and those protons are exposed to one another or get too close to one another, this can cause the atomic nucleus to flux, and this can cause the protons to want to get away from one another, and that causes that instability, that causes the gamma radiation, the beta radiation, all the radioactive emissions to occur. Isn't that neat? That's the premise behind radioactivity. And scientists use this half-life, this knowledge of half-lives, to do radiometric dating, where scientists measure the ratio of different isotopes and calculate how many half-lives have passed since the particular fossil or rock was formed. This can allow you to date fossils and say, well, this fossil, it's about 500,000 years old, whereas this fossil's 12 million years old, etc., etc. So now I'm going to share with you some facts about the electrons of an atom, which won't be very clear and won't be very understandable until we turn our attention to photosynthesis in a subsequent chapter, okay? So just keep in mind, when we talk about photosynthesis, these concepts of how electrons store energy and the energy level of electrons is going to reappear. So for now, it might be a little confusing, but bear with me in this explanation of how energy is associated with the electrons of an atom. So first of all, I just want to define energy. Energy is the capacity to cause change. And there's a form of energy known as potential energy, which is the energy that matter possesses because of its location or structure. And matter has a natural tendency to move towards the lowest possible state of potential energy. Now, this potential energy is applicable to the electrons of an atom, because those electrons of an atom differ in their amounts of potential energy. Based on what? Based on their distance from the nucleus. And these changes in potential energy of electrons can occur only in steps of fixed amounts. And these fixed amounts are dictated by what are known as electron shells. Electrons found in different electron shells, each with a characteristic average distance and energy level. So let me show you what I'm talking about. There's here you can see this is the atomic nucleus of an atom. Electrons can exist in what is known as the first shell. This shell, remember that cloud of electrons? There'll be electrons in this shell, and those are known as the lowest energy electrons. Then we go to the next shell. You can think of a shell as a layer, like a layer of electrons. And you see the next shell, the next layer of electrons, the next bigger cloud, you can think of it that way. These are higher energy electrons. And then the third shell is even further away from the atomic nucleus. These have yet more energy in these electrons. And if an electron is pushed from a more inner shell to an outer shell, that means that energy has been absorbed. And if those electrons drop from an outer shell to an inner shell, energy is released. Okay, so again, I know this is a little tricky and not very intuitive, but keep this concept in mind for photosynthesis, where this will become perfectly, a perfectly good explanation of how chlorophyll captures sunlight. Now let me explain something very important about an atom. And this is with regard to the electrons. Do you guys remember how I mentioned that the electrons live in a cloud quite far from the atomic nucleus? So if this is the atomic nucleus right here, these are the protons and the neutrons of the cell. I said that the electrons exist in this cloud that takes up a lot of space. Remember the rest of Cowboy Stadium outside of that. But that's only half the story. What you need to know is that only 2 electrons can exist in any one 3-dimensional space. And these 3-dimensional spaces are called orbitals. So again, 2 electrons for every orbital. An orbital is a 3-dimensional space. But do you remember the other term we learned about electrons and where they live? They were called shells. Do you remember that term, a shell? What I need you to know is that a shell and an orbital are not the same thing. A shell is a layer. Remember, like a layer of cake. You had the first shell, then you have a second shell, and you have a third shell. And remember, the shells are like layers of cake. They're going further and further away from the atomic nucleus. So you would have the first shell, the second shell, the third shell, and it goes on and on. There's the fourth shell, there's the fifth shell, there's a sixth and seventh shell, okay? So these are called shells. These are layers in which electrons can exist, all right? But remember, orbital and shell are two different things. The first shell of an atom has one orbital, So I'm going to ask you this. How many electrons do you think can live in that first shell if the first shell only has one orbital? And remember, only 2 electrons can exist in any one orbital. That's right, the answer is 2. And I'm going to draw the electrons in red so we can keep track. So the first shell, the first layer, contains 2 electrons. I'm just going to draw them like this. 2 electrons exist in the first layer of cake, all right, in the first shell. Because the first shell is only one 3-dimensional space, and that 3-dimensional space looks like a ball, all right, looks like a sphere. And it's called the 1s orbital, in case you're wondering. Now, because we filled that layer, with electrons, we have to kick it out to the next layer, right? We have to go from shell 1, we got to kick it out to shell 2. But here's the trick to shell 2. Shell 2 has actually not one orbital, it has 4 orbitals. It has one orbital that looks like a sphere. It's called the 2s orbital. But it also has an additional 3 orbitals that look kind of like the infinity sign. They're called dumbbell-shaped orbitals, or the p orbitals. So if that's true, let me ask you this. If that's true, if the second shell possesses 4 orbitals, 4 3-dimensional shapes in which electrons can live, how many electrons can exist in the second shell? That's right, because there's 4 orbitals, and each orbital can hold 2 electrons in that 3-dimensional space. It's 8. So we're going to draw 8 little dots for our 8 electrons in the second shell. So the second shell can house 8 total electrons before becoming totally full, all right? Great. Now, if we have 8 electrons in the second shell and 2 electrons in the first shell, now if an atom has even more electrons, guess what we have to do with those extra electrons? We have to kick it out to the third shell. Now we've got to kick it out again to the third shell. And guess what? The third shell also has 4 orbitals. Those 4 orbitals look like a inflated version of the second shell. Remember the second shell? I said it had 4 orbitals, a spherical orbital and 3 dumbbell-shaped orbitals. Well, the third shell also has a big ball, a big sphere called the 3s orbital, and it has 3 big dumbbells, right? So if that's true, again, if that's true, and the third layer of cake, the third shell, also has 4 orbitals, 4 3-dimensional spaces, how many electrons can exist in the third shell? That's right, it's another 8. So another 8 electrons can exist in the third shell. All right, check that out. And now you have filled the third shell. So if an atom had even more electrons, guess what we'd have to do? That's right, we'd have to kick it out to the next shell, the fourth shell. And that's how electrons work. Electrons exist in these orbitals and these shells. And those orbitals and shells, they fill from the inside out. And the more electrons an atom possesses, the more shells it's going to have, right? So the bigger the element is, the heavier the element is, the more protons an element has, that means it has more electrons. So the bigger the element with the more protons, you're going to have more electrons and you're going to have more shells, right? So this is how it works. And by the way, I need to define a term for you real quick. Whenever we're addressing the outer shell, whenever we're talking about the outermost shell, that is called the valence shell. So if there was one electron, look at this. If there was one electron in the fourth shell, and I asked you how many valence electrons does this atom possess, you would say one, right? Because its outermost shell, its fourth shell, contains one lonely electron. So this atom has one valence electron. So just keep in mind, valence electrons are the outermost shell electrons. Now, coming back to our slides, check out this part of a periodic table. They've isolated the first 3 rows of the periodic table, so this is not the entire table. But what you can see here is where we left off. We were talking about the first shell. Remember, the first layer of cake, I call it. The second shell, the third shell. Let's look at how the periodic table is arranged. Remember, I said that hydrogen is at the top left of the table because it has 1 proton. And by the way, if this is an atom and it has 1 proton, how many electrons should it have? If it's an atom, it should have 1 electron. And that's what this is right here. That's your single electron, right? That yellow dot represents its lone electron. And that makes sense, right? Because hydrogen has 1 proton, so it should have 1 electron. Does that make sense? And if we move over and scan to the right and we look at now helium, helium should have 2 protons, right? Because it's the second element on the table. And if it has 2 protons, how many electrons would it have? It should have 2 electrons. And which shell do you think, which shell should possess those 2 electrons? Well, of course, the most stable one, right? The one with the least energy, the first shell, possesses the 2 electrons. Does that make sense? Now, let me ask you this. If I had 3 protons, let's say I'm lithium, okay, lithium has 3 protons. How many electrons would it have? Yeah, it should have 3 electrons. But let me ask you this. 2 of those electrons occupy the first shell, which only has 1 orbital. Where would the third electron live? Could it join the first shell? No, remember the first shell can only house 2 electrons. So that electron, that third electron, needs to kick out to the next shell. It needs to exist in the second shell. So you have 1 electron living in the outermost shell. And what was the name for the outermost shell? Yeah, that's right. It was called the valence shell. Good. So let me ask you this. I'm going to quiz you. How many valence electrons does lithium have? That's right. It just has 1. So lithium has 1 valence electron. Now, let me quiz you again. How many total electrons does lithium have? That's right. Lithium has 3 total electrons. So just be aware that asking total electrons is a completely different question than asking valence electrons. Now, let's look at beryllium. Beryllium has 4 protons. So you guessed it, it has 4 electrons. 2 of the electrons exist in the first shell and 2 electrons in the second shell. Boron has 5 protons and 5 electrons. Carbon has 6 protons and 6 electrons. And again, let me ask you this. How many electrons can exist in this second shell? Do you remember from when I was at the board? That's right. The second shell can house more electrons. What, right? Do you remember why? It's because the second shell, the second layer, it doesn't just have one orbital, it has 4 orbitals. Remember that? A spherical orbital and 3 dumbbell-shaped orbitals. And let me just show you real quick what it looks like. The first shell possesses just this spherical orbital called the 1s orbital. And so it can only house 2 electrons that live in this orbital, the spherical orbital. And then when you kick it out to the second shell has 4 total orbitals. One that looks like a bigger sphere, it's called the 2s orbital. And then 3 that look like dumbbells. Now watch my mouse. This is one of the dumbbell shapes. It kind of looks like the infinity symbol. This is the Z p orbital. Okay, this is a p orbital Z. And then here's another p orbital called Y. And then here's the third one in green. This is the xp orbital. Do you see? So an atom with 2 shells would look something like this at the bottom. It would have 1 orbital in the first shell, but it has 3 orbitals in the second shell. And keep in mind, each orbital houses 2 electrons. So, again, how many electrons can exist in the second shell, which houses 4 orbitals, which has 4 orbitals? That's right, 8. That's why you have the second shell with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 electrons. See, neon has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 valence electrons. Can we add any more valence electrons to neon? Could neon accept another electron? The answer is not in the second valence shell. So when we kick it out to sodium, when we look at sodium, which has 11 protons, its 11th electron needs to start a third shell. Okay, now we've got 1 electron in the third shell. And again, how many orbitals are in the third shell? There are 4 more orbitals in the third shell because the third shell possesses another large spherical orbital and 3 more p orbitals. So how many total electrons can exist in the third shell? That's right, 8 more electrons. So argon has 8 valence electrons. Do you see what happened here? Notice this final column. Look at this last column here on the right, okay? This last column, these are known as the noble gases. And the reason they're known as noble gases is because they have filled their valence shell with electrons. If I'm talking about the first shell for helium, how many electrons fill that shell? 2, right? So helium has a full valence shell. If we look at neon, how many electrons fill the second shell? 8, right? So neon has a full valence shell. Argon has a full valence shell. So the final column on the periodic table of elements are all of the elements with a full valence shell. That's why they're on the final column on the periodic table of elements. So now we know about the periodic table of elements and its layout, don't we? We know why hydrogen is the first element. It's because it has 1 proton. We know why helium's the second one, because it has 2 protons. Further, we know why helium is pushed out to the last column. It's because it has a full valence shell. And now, don't we understand the columns too? The columns, this column has full valence shell. What's the first column have in common? Let me ask you this. What do the columns have in common? Can you tell me? Look at this closely. You see, this is a column. What do these 3 elements, hydrogen, lithium, and sodium, have in common with one another? What do the columns have in common with one another? Yes, that's right. They all have one valence electron, and that's why they're in the same column. Look at this. Hydrogen has one valence electron. Lithium has one valence electron. Sodium has one valence electron. And that's why they're in the first column. Beryllium is in the second column, along with magnesium, because they both have two valence electrons. Boron and aluminum have 3. Carbon and silicon have 4. You see how the columns work? Now we know what the columns mean. And let me tell you this. This is really exciting. The elements that have the same number of valence electrons tend to behave in a similar way in chemical reactions. Isn't that cool? It's the valence electrons that really dictate an element's chemical reactivity. These noble gases, they do not react in chemical reactions. They don't participate in chemical reactions. And that's because they have filled their valence shell with electrons. They are noble gases. Similarly, hydrogen, lithium, and sodium tend to behave in a similar fashion because they all have one valence electron. Carbon and silicon, they behave in a similar fashion because they have the same number of valence electrons. Fluorine and chlorine, they behave the same in chemical reactions, or in a very similar way anyway, in chemical reactions because they have the same number of valence electrons. Isn't that neat? So it's the valence electron complement that gives chemical properties to different atoms. Isn't that neat? Now, what do the rows represent? Let's take a look here real quick. What do the rows represent? That's right, shells. Hydrogen and helium only have electrons in the first shell. They don't have a second shell, and that's why they're in the first they're in the first row. Now, lithium through neon, these are elements where the valence shell is the second shell. So this is the second shell. And then sodium through argon, these are the elements with the electrons in the third shell. And their third shell is their valence shell. And that's what we're talking about. Isn't that neat? So now you know exactly why the periodic table is laid out in this fashion. You understand that different atomic numbers dictate different element names and identities. You understand what the columns represent, what the rows represent, and why noble gases do not react. Isn't that neat? Now, let me share something else with you that's really interesting. Remember, I told you that the noble gases in this final column of the periodic table, like helium, neon, argon, and so on, these are inert gases, which means that they do not react. So if you're trying to run a chemistry lab and you're trying to make cool reactions occur, well, these elements are not your go-to elements for having fun. Though they are kind of neat for making neon signs, the neon signs that you see in cities. But other than that, there's really not a lot of cool chemistry going on with these noble gases because they don't react with one another and they don't react with any of the other elements. So this is why chemistry happens. This is really interesting. The reason why chemicals react with one another and the reason why chemistry occurs and chemical reactions are happening all around us every day is because these other elements who are not the noble gases, these other elements want to feel what it's like to be a noble gas. They seek to fill their outermost shell with electrons. That's their mission. Their mission is to fill their valence shell with electrons and get to a more stable state like that of the noble gases. Isn't that cool? So the entire reason why chemical bonds form and chemical reactions occur is because the other elements are trying desperately to fill their outermost shells and feel what it's like to be noble, to be a noble inert gas, right? So they want to fill their valence shell with electrons, and that's why oxygen will react with hydrogen to make water, right? This is why the different elements react with one another. This is why chemistry goes. This is why chemistry works. This is why chemistry is interesting, and there are chemical reactions happening all around us. It's because chemical bonds are forming, because these different elements, they need to work together in order to either steal from one another, steal electrons, give away electrons, share electrons, all in an effort to fill their outermost shell. And the reason why chemical bonds form, the reason why two elements, two atoms come together to form a bond is because of that reason. It's because they're trying to fill their outermost shell. And the way to do that is what? It's to share electrons, steal electrons, or give away electrons. So that's the next concept. After we check out what Gizmo and Wicket are up to, and I'm sure it's not that good, we'll come back and we'll talk about chemical bonds and just how these elements work out their differences in order to fill their outermost shells. So let me give you an example of how atoms can share electrons to fill their outermost shell and become more stable and feel like those noble gases. So let me give you the most basic example. Do you remember your friend hydrogen? H for hydrogen. Remember, it only had one proton. So how many valence electrons does hydrogen have? Well, it only has one electron, right? Now, let me ask you this. Does hydrogen have a full valence shell? No. It can house one more electron in that shell. Does that make sense? Remember, because hydrogen has one valence electron, that means it's in the first shell. The first shell can house two electrons. So hydrogen wants one more electron to fill its outermost shell. Now, so what do you think would happen if another hydrogen were to come along, right? Another hydrogen with its one electron were to come along and they meet. Could they work out some kind of deal in order to fill their outermost shells? And that's sharing, right? Look, if this hydrogen shares its electron with this hydrogen, they're each sharing with each other. This is known as Lewis dot structure format of writing, by the way. Then guess what? By sharing with one another, they each feel like they have access to two electrons. They feel like they've filled their outermost shell, right? So look, this hydrogen thinks it has two electrons. This hydrogen thinks it has two electrons. They filled their outermost shell. It's like if you share a car with your brother has a car, you have a car, you're saying you're sharing each other's cars. What do you tell all your friends, right? Well, you tell your friends you have two cars. But do you technically have two cars? No, because one's technically your brother's, but he's sharing with you. It's just kind of a fun little analogy. But again, by sharing those electrons, these hydrogens believe they have access to two electrons, and so they believe they have a full valence shell. So this is a much more stable molecule. This has now formed into a molecule called H2, or hydrogen gas. Okay, and another way of drawing this is with a line showing that sharing. Okay, now this is sharing, right? Once you're sharing electrons, you need to hang out with one another. That's called a bond, right? And anytime you form a bond by sharing the electrons, that's known as a covalent bond. So there is a single covalent bond between two hydrogens, holding them together as hydrogen gas. Now, what if different elements come into contact? Let's give you an example of that. What about oxygen? Do you remember how many valence electrons oxygen had? That's right, it had 6 valence electrons. So let's draw those valence electrons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, 6 valence electrons for oxygen. So is oxygen satisfied? Has it filled its outermost shell? Has it filled that second shell with electrons? Or could it have more? It could have more, right? Because remember, the second shell can house 8 electrons. So 2 more. Oxygen is looking for 2 more electrons. Now, what happens if a hydrogen floats by? A hydrogen with its single electron, could they maybe work out some kind of deal? Well, yeah, look. The oxygen could say, hey, hey, hydrogen, I'll share this electron if you share yours, right? And now they're sharing. The oxygen is sharing an electron with hydrogen, and hydrogen is sharing an electron with oxygen. So there's a covalent bond formed between the oxygen and the hydrogen. Now, hydrogen is satisfied, isn't it? Hydrogen's satisfied. Hydrogen's happy. It has access to 2 electrons. Hydrogen's great. But what about oxygen? Is oxygen full yet? Let's count. Oxygen believes it has access to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 electrons. Close but no cigar, right? So one more hydrogen floats along. Here's another hydrogen. Can they work out a deal? Yep. Oxygen will share this one. Hydrogen will share that one. And they are sharing. Now, isn't everyone happy? Let's take a look. This hydrogen has 2 electrons. This hydrogen has 2 electrons. And the oxygen sees how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And it takes 8 electrons to fill the second shell. So everyone is happy. Everyone in this partnership has access to a full valence complement, a full valence shell. Isn't that awesome? So this is the most stable that an oxygen and 2 hydrogens can become. It forms a molecule called what? What do you think this is called? There's 2 H's and an O. H2O. This is water, right? Water. Wonderful. And that is why water forms. Oxygen and hydrogen form covalent bonds, single covalent bonds. And again, you could draw this as O, line H, line H. Every time you see a single line like that, it's a single covalent bond. And water is a molecule with 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. And now you know why water forms. All right, let me show you another option that oxygen has that's very common. Remember, oxygen has 6 valence electrons. We had mentioned that just in a previous example. Oxygen has 6 valence electrons. It wishes it had 2 more electrons, right? Now, what do you think happens if another oxygen moseys along here? So you have another oxygen right next to it with its 6 valence electrons. Each oxygen has 6 valence electrons. You see what I'm saying? You think they can sort out some kind of deal? Well, let's start sharing. This oxygen says, I'll share this one, and this oxygen wants to share that one. So now each oxygen is sharing an electron with the other oxygen. Does that make sense? Now, let's see if this is satisfactory. Have the oxygens filled their valence shell? So this oxygen sees 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so again, this is a close situation, but we could do better, right? If this oxygen were to share another electron, and this oxygen were to share a second electron, now what do we have? Have the oxygens filled their valence shell? Let's see. Oxygen sees 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This oxygen sees 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. They filled their outermost shell. But did you see what happened? Each oxygen had to share 2 of its electrons with the other partner. And so this forms a molecule. Isn't this sharing too? That's sharing, isn't it? So these are covalent bonds. So this is known as oxygen gas, or O2. However, because each of these oxygens had to share 2 of their electrons with the single partner. This is known as a double covalent bond, and you would draw it with two lines. Does that make sense? You would need to put two lines between the oxygens to show that there are two covalent bonds. You see, it's a double covalent bond. For every electron you share with a partner, that's a single covalent bond. So remember, hydrogen shared one electron with hydrogen. That's a single covalent bond for hydrogen gas. But here, oxygen is sharing two electrons with another oxygen, so that's actually a double covalent bond. Now, you might be asking, is there such thing as a triple covalent bond, Dr. D? And there is. Let me show you. Okay, so let me show you this. Nitrogen. Nitrogen has 5 valence electrons, okay? 5 valence electrons. So how many more would nitrogen need in order to fill its second shell, its outermost shell? That's right, it needs 3 more valence electrons to fill that shell. Because remember, it can have 8 electrons in this shell. So here we go. Another nitrogen comes along, and it has 5 valence electrons. Can they sort out something, maybe a little sharing deal? Yes. This nitrogen says, I'll share this electron. This nitrogen shares 1 electron. Now they're each sharing 1. Now let's see if we fill the shell. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, not yet. Okay, we need to share some more. This nitrogen shares with this. Okay, each one shares another electron. Now each nitrogen sees 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Closer, but still not good enough. In this case, this nitrogen will share a 3rd electron with this nitrogen will share a 3rd one as well. Now look at this. Now are they satisfied? Now they're satisfied. Now each nitrogen has access to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now the nitrogens have filled their outermost shell. By each nitrogen shared 3 electrons with its partner. So this would be an N with 3 bonds to another N. And that's known as a triple covalent bond, forming a gas called N2, also known as nitrogen gas. Now, as I mentioned at the board, atoms with incomplete valence shells can share or transfer valence electrons with certain other atoms. When this happens, these interactions usually result in atoms staying close together, held together by attractions called chemical bonds. And the type of chemical bond we just covered on the board is a covalent bond, where there's sharing of a pair of valence electrons by 2 atoms. So remember on the board I showed you 2 hydrogens, each hydrogen with 1 valence electron. They came together, they shared those valence electrons, and we formed hydrogen gas. So this is a type of covalent bond, a single covalent bond. And when a covalent bond forms, that forms a molecule. A molecule consists of 2 or more atoms held together by covalent bonds. Again, a single covalent bond is the sharing of just 1 pair of valence electrons. A double covalent bond is the sharing of 2 pairs of valence electrons. And do you remember the notation we used to represent atoms and bonding? There was a line, right? A single covalent bond is denoted with a single line. However, a double covalent bond is denoted with a double line. And the molecular formula is written out like this: H2 or O2 or H2O. And here we can see some of the molecules that I had drawn on the board. This is a hydrogen molecule drawn 1, 2, 3, 4 different ways. An oxygen drawn 4 different ways. And remember, oxygen has a double covalent bond. A water molecule drawn 4 different ways. And methane drawn 4 different ways. This here is known as the electron distribution diagram. When you see molecules drawn this way, this one here is the Lewis dot structure. This one is called the structural formula. And lastly, this is the space filling model. It shows you how much space those atoms take up as part of the molecule. And do you remember that the valence electrons are the electrons in the outer shell? Covalent bonds can form between atoms of the same element or atoms of different elements. I showed you that. Hydrogens can bond together to form H2, or they can bond to other elements as well, like oxygen. A hydrogen and an oxygen can bind. A compound is a combination of 2 or more different elements. Now, when molecules form, we need to understand something that can happen when this sharing occurs in covalent bonds. And to do so, we need to understand this concept of electronegativity. So let me show you this. Atoms in a molecule attract electrons to varying degrees. This means that different atoms attract electrons to different degrees. This is known as electronegativity. Electronegativity is an atom's attraction for the electrons in a covalent bond. Some atoms are more attracted to the electrons. They pull the electrons closer to them, and some are less so, and so they do not pull electrons closer to them. The more electronegative an atom is, the more strongly it pulls shared electrons towards itself. And look at the periodic table of elements right here at the bottom. Take a look at this. What I want to show you is that electronegativity, an atom's pull or affinity for electrons, increases as we look to the right of the periodic table. So the elements on the right side of the periodic table have more electronegativity than on the left side, and as we look up on the periodic table. So the most electronegative of the elements are right here at the top right of the periodic table, and the least electronegative of the elements are down here at the bottom left of the periodic table. One thing about electronegativity that I need you to know, it's a very important exception to the rule. And remember, the rule that I mentioned was that the electronegativity of atoms increases as you look to the right and up on the periodic table of elements. Electronegativity increases, but there's one exception that you need to know, and that's this. On the periodic table, hydrogen should actually be right on top of carbon. Okay, so it would look a little something like this. All right, so why is that? I want to tell you something. Hydrogen and carbon have roughly the same electronegativity. So that's why I'm telling you this exception. You should know, you should remember that hydrogen and carbon have roughly the same electronegativity. And that means that if they're going to share electrons, they're going to share electrons evenly, okay? So carbon and hydrogen have roughly the same electronegativity. And students ask why? Why, Dr. D? Why does hydrogen and carbon have the same greediness for electrons? Why would hydrogen and carbon have the same electronegativity? Why isn't hydrogen like lithium or sodium, which is on the left side of the periodic table? Well, let me explain that real quick. hydrogen has how many valence electrons? Do you remember? Let's draw this out. Hydrogen has how many valence electrons? 1, right? 1. How many does it wish it had to fill its valence shell? Another one, right? So hydrogen wishes it had 1 more to fill its shell. So would you agree that hydrogen was half full of electrons? Yep. Okay, now see where I'm getting with this. Carbon has how many valence electrons? Do you remember? Carbon has 4. Carbon has 4 valence electrons, and it exists on the second row of the periodic table. So its valence shell is the second shell. How many more electrons does carbon require to fill that shell? 4, right? So 4 more. It has 4, and it wants 4 more to fill its shell. So would you agree that carbon is also half full of electrons in its valence shell? You see where I'm getting? Hydrogen is half full. It has 1 electron. It wants 2. Carbon is half full. It has 4 valence electrons, and it wants 8. The elements that are half full are going to be equally greedy for electrons. Whereas hydrogen, if hydrogen is way over near sodium, do you see the problem here? Sodium has 1 valence electron, but how many more does sodium want? Or lithium? Okay, lithium with its 1 valence electron. Do you see why hydrogen would not have the same greediness as lithium or sodium? Lithium has 1 valence electron, just like sodium does, but lithium needs 7 more, right? So it's not going to act the same. Sodium has 1 valence electron, it wants 7 more, okay? So this is what we're talking about. Hydrogen is half full, so it's going to be as greedy as carbon, which is half full, and silicon, which is half full. Isn't that neat? So this is why hydrogen has the same electronegativity, roughly, as carbon. So now let's talk about types of covalent bonds. There are different aspects of how covalent bonds behave between different atoms. And I just want to share this concept with you. Again, if hydrogen has 1 valence electron and another hydrogen has 1 valence electron, remember what they do when they come into contact, they share. So this hydrogen shares an electron with this one, and now a single covalent bond has formed. So now let me ask you this. Hydrogen is sharing with hydrogen. So are those electrons going to be shared evenly among the two? Remember, the electrons are not stuck in the middle like this. I know this is a Lewis dot structure, and it looks like the electrons are stuck in the middle, but they're not. The electrons can be anywhere in those orbitals, right? So both electrons could be here 1 second, then the next split second, 1 electron might be over here and 1 electron's over there. The next split second, both electrons are over here. So the electrons are pretty much anywhere in this cloud. But let me ask you this. If these 2 hydrogens are sharing these 2 electrons, and they're both equally greedy for the electrons, are those electrons going to spend too much time with this hydrogen? Probably not. Are they going to spend too much time with that hydrogen? Probably not. So the electrons are going to be shared evenly. So imagine this. Again, remember my example with sharing a car with your brother? If I have a car and my brother has a car, and we're sharing the cars, if we're both equally needy of a car and equally greedy for the car, we're both going to spend the same amount of time with the cars. Does that make sense? Okay, so this means that the electrons are shared evenly. Anytime electrons are shared with the same element, 2 of the same element, they're going to be shared evenly. So if electrons are shared by 2 hydrogens, the electrons are shared evenly. If electrons are shared by, remember this one? two oxygens, the electrons are going to be shared evenly. If electrons are shared by two, do you remember this one? Nitrogens with their triple covalent bond, the electrons are going to be shared evenly. Again, because oxygen is not greedier than oxygen, anytime you have sharing of electrons between two equally greedy partners, the sharing is going to be even. And what does that mean, the sharing is going to be even? Again, that means that the electrons these electrons that are being shared spend just as much time with this oxygen as they do with this oxygen. Neither of the oxygens is hogging those electrons, okay? And so, by the way, when this happens, when electrons are being shared evenly to form a covalent bond, those aren't just covalent bonds. Those are known as nonpolar covalent bonds. So hydrogen gas, oxygen gas, and nitrogen gas are forming not just single, double, and triple covalent bonds respectively, but they are nonpolar covalent bonds, and that's why. Now let me show you a little bit different scenario. Remember your oxygen friend? Oxygen has 6 valence electrons, and do you remember that's why it pairs up with 2 hydrogens, remember, to form water? We talked about this. So these are all sharing. So there's a covalent bond between the oxygen and this hydrogen, and there's another covalent bond between the oxygen and this hydrogen, right? But now let me ask you this. Do you remember how electronegativity works? The electronegativity is greater for atoms that are to the right and up on the periodic table of elements. And do you remember even if you put hydrogen on top of carbon, oxygen's still to the right, which means it's more electronegative, isn't it? And do you remember what electronegative means? Electronegative means greedy for electrons. It technically means the affinity of an atom for electrons. So oxygen has a greater affinity for electrons. Oxygen is greedier for electrons than hydrogen. Why? Again, because it's to the right on the periodic table. It is greedier. So do you think if oxygen's greedier than these hydrogens, that the sharing is going to be even, Steven? Right? So if my brother is much greedier than me and I'm sharing a car with him, am I going to have equal access to that car, or is he going to kind of hog that car and the car is going to spend too much time with him? You see what I'm saying? So look at this. The electrons here, you see the electrons are supposed to spend the same amount of time with the oxygen as they do the hydrogen. That's what sharing means, right? But if the oxygen's kind of like this electron magnet, like this electron vacuum cleaner, then the electrons are spending way too much time with this oxygen and not so much time with this hydrogen, okay? And you might be wondering, well, so what? Why do we care if the electrons are spending more time with the oxygen than the hydrogen? Well, it's still sharing, but it's an uneven sharing, and that's what you need to understand. The sharing is uneven. The electrons are spending way more of their time with the oxygen than the hydrogens. Now, do you remember what keeps these atoms and these molecules neutral? Remember we talked about neutral? When you have a proton and an electron close by, that keeps everything neutral, right? If you have a plus and a minus, that's when you have neutrality, right? So these hydrogens have a proton, right? But what do you think happens when its negative charge drifts away, or it's spending too much time with that oxygen? Well, think about it. What charge are these electrons? What charge do electrons have? They have a negative charge. And that negative charge is spending too much time where? That negative charge is spending too much time with this oxygen. That means that this oxygen starts becoming partially negatively charged. This is not an S. This is the symbol for the Greek letter D, lowercase d, for delta. And this signifies that the oxygen is partially negatively charged. And that leaves the hydrogens partially what? They are partially positively charged. All right, did you see what happened? For these charges to not appear, you would have to be sharing the electrons evenly. But because oxygen is greedier and it's like hogging those electrons a little too much, that negative charge is kind of culminating here. It's manifesting here on the oxygen as a partial negative charge. And the hydrogens are left with a partial positive charge. And this is known as not just a covalent bond, but because it's uneven and it's forming these poles, this is known as a polar covalent bond. And yes, this is why some molecules are called polar molecules. You ever heard that water is a polar molecule? Well, now you know why. Now, are you ready for a tricky example here? All right, let's think about this one. If we have carbon, and do you remember that carbon has 4 valence electrons? How many electrons does carbon need to fill its shell? Carbon needs 4 more electrons to fill its shell, right? It has, remember, it's half full. It has 4 electrons. It needs 4 more. So what do you think happens if a hydrogen floats by? Yes, that's right, they can share. Is carbon happy? No, not yet. So what if another hydrogen were to share? It's more happy. Another hydrogen could share, and a 4th hydrogen shares. So look at this. This is a carbon filling its outermost shell by sharing with 4 hydrogens. You see, carbon can form 4 bonds because it needs 4 more electrons. That's why carbon can make 4 bonds, right? So this is a molecule called methane. And methane is CH4, okay? Now let me ask you this. Are these covalent bonds between the carbon and the hydrogen? Yes, they are covalent bonds. But now this is the part which requires you to recall. Are these polar covalent bonds or non-polar covalent bonds? Exactly, they are non-polar covalent bonds. Why? Because of that very important exception I needed you to remember, that carbon and hydrogen have roughly the same electronegativity. They are equally greedy for electrons. So even though they don't have the same identity, carbon and hydrogen aren't the same thing, you know, because I told you that exception, because I told you carbon and hydrogen have the same electronegativity, they do share the electrons evenly, okay? So the correct answer is carbon and hydrogen forming methane, CH4, these develop single non-polar covalent bonds, okay? And if that's true, let me ask you this. If everyone's sharing the electrons evenly, would there be any charges forming, like partial positive or partial negative charges anywhere? If you're sharing evenly, do these partial charges pop up anywhere? No, there shouldn't be any partial charges popping up because for every proton, there's an electron nearby, just like there should be. And so no charges pop up. And this is a non-polar molecule. So if you ever heard of non-polar molecules, this is a non-polar molecule, and that's why. Now let me tell you something fascinating. In the next chapter, we're going to learn about biomolecules. We're going to learn about fats and oils. Fats and oils are typically non-polar. Isn't that neat? Fats and oils are non-polar. And did you know that fats and oils and lipids in general, they are mainly made of carbon and hydrogen? Do you see why fats and oils and other lipids are non-polar? Okay, well, that's because fats, oils, and lipids are mainly giant molecules made up of carbons and hydrogens. And because they're mainly carbon and hydrogen form non-polar bonds, that makes those fats and oils non-polar. So again, Nonpolar covalent bonds are covalent bonds where atoms share the electrons evenly, no partial charges form, and this results in a nonpolar molecule. And in polar covalent bonds, one atom is more greedy, more electronegative, and the atoms do not share the electrons equally. This results in partial charges. Unequal sharing of electrons causes a partial positive or negative charge for each atom or molecule. Remember, for example, in water, oxygen was left with a partial negative charge because oxygen is more electronegative, while the hydrogens were left with a partial positive charge because they are less electronegative. So here you can see what I'm talking about. Here's the lowercase d Greek letter I was telling you about, delta. Here you have a partial negative charge on the oxygen and a partial positive charge on each of the hydrogen atoms in this water molecule. And these yellow arrows are showing you this uneven distribution of electrons. Oxygen is hogging those electrons. The electrons are being drawn closer to oxygen, spending too much time with oxygen. And this is what's responsible for this polarity. And that's why water is known as a polar molecule, because it develops these polar ends. Now let me ask you this. What do you think happens when a water molecule, and remember, a water molecule is a oxygen and two hydrogens, right? And do you remember the partial charges that form on that water molecule due to the polar covalent bonds? The hydrogens have a partial what charge? A partial positive charge. And the oxygen has a partial negative charge. Right, exactly. So what do you think happens if another water molecule moseys by? Okay, remember, here's a water molecule. Here's a different water molecule. The water molecules have partially positive hydrogens and a partially negative oxygen. Do you think this water molecule can interact with that water molecule? Yeah, they can interact actually. And let me tell you this, at the molecular level, opposites attract. You need to know that at the molecular level, opposites attract. So positively charged things like to stick to negatively charged things. Positive and negatives like to come together. So what part of the water molecule is negative? That's right, the oxygen. And what part of this water molecule is positive? That's right, the hydrogen. So do you think this hydrogen, which is partially positively charged, might want to stick to and interact with this oxygen that is partially negatively charged? That's exactly right. They will kind of stick to one another. Just, it's a loose stickiness. It doesn't make it a bigger molecule. By the way, so it's a type of bond, but it doesn't make this like a big molecule. It just means this molecule of water likes to stick a little bit to that water molecule, okay? And why do they like to stick together? Well, because this partially positive charge wants to hang out with this partially negatively charged. And that stickiness is denoted as a bunch of dots, right? So when you see little dots like this, when you see little dots like I drew there, that means there's a little bit of stickiness between oppositely charged partial charges, right? And that's known as a hydrogen bond. Okay, a hydrogen bond. Isn't that neat? A hydrogen bond formed between the two water molecules. So it's like a little, it's a very weak bond. Hydrogen bonds are weak interactions. Now let me ask you this, would two water molecules want to interact in this fashion with the oxygens pointing to one another? Let me ask you that. Would two water molecules want to have their partially negatively charged oxygens stick to one another? No, it wouldn't. the oxygens would not want to interact, and hydrogens would not want to interact either, right? So look, the hydrogens would not want to interact, the oxygens would not want to interact between different water molecules. So if this were to happen, this water molecule would flip around, right? It would flip around and put its hydrogen here. Okay, does that make sense? Because its hydrogen's partially positive, the oxygen's partially negative, and how do we denote a hydrogen bond? That's right, little dots, right? So hydrogen bonds, and this water molecule would flip around too, right? This water molecule would flip around where the oxygen's over here, and that partially negatively charged oxygen would stick to the partially positively charged hydrogen. And so water molecules, because they are polar, they will stick to one another. So polar molecules can stick to other polar molecules. And that's because of those partial charges. And the partially positive charge of one polar molecule will like to stick to the partially negatively charged of another water molecule. Does that make sense? And that stickiness of water molecules to one another has a name. When water molecules stick to one another by hydrogen bonding with one another, this is called cohesion. Now what I've drawn for you here is the Lewis dot structure of ammonia, nitrogen with 3 hydrogens, NH3, ammonia. Now let me ask you this. Ammonia, is it a polar molecule or a nonpolar molecule? How would you figure that out? Well, do you remember electronegativity, right? Is nitrogen to the right of hydrogen, where I told you hydrogen should be? Hydrogen should be right on top of carbon. Nitrogen is to its right. That means that nitrogen is actually more electronegative than hydrogen. Nitrogen's greedier. So where do those electrons spend more of their time? The electrons are being hogged by nitrogen, and do you remember electrons have a negative charge? So the negative charge is being drawn to the nitrogen. The nitrogen develops what? A partial negative charge, leaving the hydrogens with a partial positive charge, okay? So again, let me ask you this. Are these polar covalent bonds between the hydrogens and the nitrogen, or are these non-polar covalent bonds? These are polar covalent bonds because of the uneven sharing, because nitrogen is more electronegative than hydrogens. And so this is a polar molecule. Ammonia is a polar molecule. So what does that mean for you? Why do we care? Well, let me ask you this. What do you think happens if a water molecule comes along? Let me ask you this. Think about this. Water. Remember, water is polar. The hydrogens have a partial positive charge, and the oxygen has a partial negative charge. Can that water molecule stick? Can it stick to ammonia? The answer is yes, right? Remember, opposites attract. This nitrogen is partially negatively charged. This hydrogen on the water is partially positively charged. Can they stick to one another? Yes. And what are these that I just drew? What are these little dots? That denotes what? A hydrogen bond. That's right. Hydrogen bonds can form between the hydrogen of water and the nitrogen of ammonia. And what if another water molecule was over here? What part of that water molecule would interact with the hydrogens of ammonia? That's right, it would be the oxygen, the partially negatively charged oxygen. Remember, the oxygen is partially negatively charged. On this ammonia, the hydrogen is partially positively charged. Would there be a stickiness? And how do you denote the stickiness? That's right, a series of dots showing a hydrogen bond. So do you agree that water can stick to polar molecules such as ammonia? Well, guess what? That's important to understand. You know why? Because ammonia dissolves in water. Have you ever heard that water is a good solvent? Have you ever heard that term? Water is a good solvent. Water dissolves a number of things. A solvent is a chemical in which you dissolve things into, right? And water is a great solvent. You can use water to dissolve lots of stuff. And you could dissolve ammonia in water. What do you think Windex is, for instance? All right? So let me tell you something. Anything that water can stick to and make hydrogen bonds with can be dissolved in water, okay? Water can dissolve any substance that's polar or charged. Isn't that neat? For example, sodium ion, Na+, sodium ion. Do you think water could dissolve sodium ion, Na+? And how? What part of the water molecule would dissolve sodium ion? That's right, it's oxygens, right? The partially negatively charged oxygen of water would form a hydrogen bond with the sodium. So water can dissolve sodium. What about chloride? Chloride is Cl-. Can water dissolve chloride? Yes. And what part of the water would stick to the negatively charged chloride? That's right, the hydrogens. So if I had a water molecule here, the partially positively charged hydrogen would hydrogen bond with the chloride. Isn't that neat? So do you think chloride can be dissolved in water? The answer is yes. As a rule of thumb, you know what I like to say, if water can stick to a molecule or an ion, water can dissolve that molecule or that ion. So what kinds of substances can be dissolved in water? Again, water can dissolve anything that's polar, that means it has partial charges, or charged, that means ions, either cations, positively charged ions like sodium, or anions, negatively charged ions like chloride. Isn't that neat? So this is why water is not a universal solvent. You ever tried to dissolve oil in water? What happens when you try to dissolve oil in water? That's right, they separate. Water can't dissolve oil. They separate out, right? Oil and water separate. So let me ask you this before I show you. What property do you think oil has that doesn't allow water to stick to it? That's right, it's nonpolar, right? Oil is nonpolar. Fats are nonpolar. Waxes are nonpolar. These types of substances don't dissolve in water because they are nonpolar. So I'm going to show you an example. What was this molecule? Do you remember we have a carbon? Remember, carbon has 4 valence electrons, but here it's sharing electrons with 4 hydrogens. What was this molecule called? This is CH4, also known as, that's right, methane. Methane. And what did we know about the properties, the chemical properties of methane? Is it a polar molecule or a nonpolar molecule? And why? Remember, that's right, it's a nonpolar molecule. Why? Because there are no partial charges anywhere. Why? Because hydrogen and carbon are equal in electronegativity. And that means that the electrons in the covalent bonds are shared evenly, right? So this is a nonpolar molecule. There's no partial charges or full charges anywhere. Now let me ask you this. If a water molecule were to mosey by, okay, see this water molecule right here? Remember, oxygen has what charge? By the way, let me tell you something. If you say oxygen is negatively charged and just put a minus there, and you say the hydrogens are positively charged and just put a plus there, that's actually wrong. Is that a full negative charge on that oxygen? No, it's a partial. Remember, you have to put the Greek letter D, right? And is that a full plus charge on those hydrogens or a partial plus charge? It's a partial plus charge, so Greek letter D on those. Anyway, water is a polar molecule. It has partial charges due to the polar covalent bonds. Methane is a nonpolar molecule. It does not have partial charges because it has nonpolar covalent bonds. So let me ask you this, all right? Think about this. What part of water would stick to methane? Go ahead and think about it. Would the partially negatively charged oxygen stick to any part of methane? No, because that oxygen wants to stick to anything that's positively charged. Would the partially positively charged hydrogens want to stick to methane anywhere? Nope, because those would want to stick to something that's in some way negatively charged, right? So let me ask you this. What part of water would stick to methane? That's a trick question, right? No part of water would want to stick to methane. Water only knows how to stick to you if you have a charge. If you have a plus charge of some kind, be it a partial plus charge or a full plus charge. If you have a negative charge of some kind, be it a partial negative charge or a partial or a real full-on negative charge. You see what I'm saying? Water only knows how to stick to molecules if they have some kind of charge. And remember, if water can stick to you, water can dissolve you, right? Can water stick to methane? No. So do you think water could dissolve methane? No. Okay, now you get it. And guess what oils, fats, and waxes have in common with methane? Do oils, waxes, and fats mix with water? No. And why is that? Well, because we're going to learn about this. Oils, fats, waxes, all the lipids, right? Most of the lipids, they are made up of almost entirely C and H, which means they're nonpolar. They're making nonpolar covalent bonds. So fats, oils, waxes, they're these big molecules that are just carbons and hydrogens. There's no partial charges anywhere. There's no full charges anywhere. Water can't stick to you. And if water can't stick to you, the water separates out, right? And oil and water separate. Do you see now why oil separates from water? Now you understand at a basic, fundamental, molecular level, you now understand deeply why oil and water don't mix. Isn't that neat? So these hydrogen bonds that I spoke of, these are an example of weak chemical interactions. Hydrogen bonds form when a hydrogen atom covalently bonded to one electronegative atom is also attracted to another electronegative atom. So I showed you some examples with water forming the hydrogen bond with ammonia. And remember how you denote a hydrogen bond with little dots? And remember that water can also hydrogen bond with itself, a process known as cohesion. And also water can hydrogen bond with pretty much any other ions, right? Positively charged, negatively charged, anything with a charge can form bonds with these weak bonds with water. Now, if electrons are not evenly distributed in a molecule, they may accumulate by chance in one part of a molecule. And we can see that this can cause weak interactions called van der Waals interactions, interactions between molecules that are close together as a result of these charges, these partial charges. And here you can see a gecko's toe is designed to take advantage of these weak interactions, these van der Waals interactions. So now let me show you a different scenario with a different outcome, with a different arrangement, all right? This here is sodium atom, Na. And remember, sodium is in the first column on the periodic table, so it has 1 valence electron. Chlorine is in the second last column, so it has 7 valence electrons. Chlorine just needs 1 more to fill its shell. However, let me ask you this. How many more does sodium need to fill its shell? It's in the second row, right? So sodium technically needs 7 more. Oh goodness, right? 7 more. Okay, think about that for a second. Sodium needs 7 more, and chlorine only needs 1 more. Now, what do you think would happen? Let's think about this. I asked my students to think about this, right? So imagine if sodium comes close, right? Sodium comes close. I ask, okay, could they share? Could sodium share its 1 valence electron with chlorine? And let's just say they did share. Now, is chlorine satisfied? Has chlorine filled its outermost shell? And the answer is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Chlorine is good. Chlorine has filled its outermost shell. But now let's look at this sodium over here. Sodium now has access to 2. So remember, sodium needs 6 more, and it's not going to find 6 more electrons. That would mean it would need to partner with 6 friends on this side, and that's just not going to happen. So there's no covalent bond that forms between sodium and chlorine, because chlorine would be happy, but sodium would not, right? And that's why a covalent bond would not form between sodium and chlorine. Sodium just would not have filled its shell, and it wouldn't be able to fill its shell. So this would not be a stable molecule. Does that make sense? But let me ask you this. What would happen if sodium, which has 1 valence electron, what if sodium just said, hey, why don't you just take my electron, take it, it's yours. Think about that for a second. So not sharing, this is not sharing. Sodium literally gives its electron to chlorine. So sodium gives its valence electron to chlorine. So let me ask you this. What happened to the third shell of sodium? That's right, it's gone. The third shell disappears, and now sodium has a full second shell. Isn't that neat? The third shell disappears, you drop down to the second shell, and the second shell of sodium is full. So by giving its 1 valence electron to chlorine, it obliterated that valence shell. It dropped down to the next smaller shell. It dropped down to the second shell, which is already full. So sodium, it cheated. It didn't have to find 7 other electrons. By giving away that 1, it filled its outermost shell. That was the easiest way for sodium to fill its outermost shell, was to just give away that electron. Does that make sense? But there's consequences, right? When you give away an electron, what happens? Do you remember the definition of an atom? An atom has the same number of protons and electrons. Okay? So the only reason sodium was an atom and sodium had no charge is because it had the same number of protons and electrons. Does that make sense? But what did it just do? It just gave chlorine an electron. So now, doesn't it have 1 more proton than it does electrons? It just gave away a negative charge. It just gave away an electron. So what charge is left over? It has 1 positive charge. Sodium has 1 positive charge. Not a partial positive charge, a full-on positive charge. So sodium has a positive charge. And look at chlorine. Chlorine just gained an electron. It outright stole that electron. Does that make sense? So chlorine has what charge? Chlorine has now an extra negative charge. So chlorine becomes what's called chloride, which is a negatively charged, right? A negative charge entity. So now let me ask you this, just to test your understanding. Is sodium still called an atom? No, because remember, by definition, atoms have an equal number of protons and electrons. So sodium is now called an ion, and chlorine is now called an ion as well. So this is not called sodium atom anymore because it does not have an equal number of electrons and protons. It is called sodium ion, and this is called chloride, which is an ion as well, or chlorine ion, which is known as chloride. And by the way, a positively charged ion is known as a cation, and a negatively charged ion is known as an anion. One way I tell my students that they can remember that is that, you know how I love my cats, Gizmo and Wicket, right? Everyone knows that. Well, I always remember that cats are a positive thing, right? I even had a student tell me that paws, you know, like cats have paws. So cats are a positive thing. So cations are positive charges. Anyway, it's a silly mnemonic device, a silly trick to remembering that, you know, positive charges are cations. Now, let's get back to this. So sodium cation and chloride anion form. Now, what do you know about opposite charges? What did I tell you about opposite charges? Opposite charges attract in chemistry. In chemistry, opposite charges attract. So sodium is positively charged, chloride is negatively charged, and guess what? Simply because they have opposite charges, they snap together, all right? They snap right together. And that is formed an ionic bond. So is this a covalent bond? No way. There's no sharing going on. Covalent bonds are about sharing. This is an ionic bond because it's the bond that forms between oppositely charged ions. Before we move on from ionic bonds, I want to introduce some important terminology that's going to help you so much when we're talking about cellular respiration in a later chapter, and that is the terms oxidized and reduced. Oxidation versus reduction. Okay, so bear with me. Let me explain this. Do you remember what happened when sodium atom met chlorine atom? What happened? Did they share electrons? No. Sodium lost its electron to chlorine, right? So sodium lost its electron, chlorine gained an electron. And here's what I want you to know. The term for losing an electron is called oxidation. The term for gaining an electron is called reduction. So, in the reaction that I told you about, where sodium atom meets up with chlorine atom, remember what happened? Sodium lost its electron and now has a positive charge. Chlorine gained an electron. And so what scientists would say is that sodium was oxidized and chlorine was reduced. Loss of electrons is called oxidation. Loss of electrons is called oxidation. Gain of electrons is called reduction. So in this chemical reaction, sodium atom was oxidized to sodium cation, while chlorine atom was reduced to chloride, the anion. Here are some more interesting facts about ionic bonds. So ionic bonds form anytime column 1 on the periodic table of elements, column 1 encounters the second last column, right? Column 1 encounters the second last column, this kind of ionic bond will form. And those form compounds like salt. This NaCl is known as salt, table salt, table salt. And did you know that anytime column 1 meets the second last column, a salt is formed, and there's more than one salt? So for example, potassium chloride forms because potassium's in the first column with chloride being in the second last column. And potassium chloride forms an ionic bond between the potassium cation and the chloride anion, and that's a salt. Also, for example, sodium fluoride can form. Sodium fluoride. That's another salt. Or potassium fluoride is a salt. So salts form as compounds, right? Compounds between column 1 and the second last column. Here's another confusing fun fact about ionic bonds. I was really confused when I went to college because I took a chemistry class and a biology class at the same time, so concurrently. In my chemistry class, I learned from the textbook that ionic bonds are strong bonds. But then I took my biology class and the textbook said that ionic bonds are weak. So which is it? Are they strong or weak? And which one's wrong? Which textbook was wrong? Well, it turns out they were both right. And I just want to explain to you why real quick, because I was confused and I don't want you to be confused. That's why. The reason is because chemistry deals with actual elements as they are, the pure elements. So if I have, let's say, sodium chloride, let's focus on sodium chloride here. If I have sodium chloride, what is that? That's salt. Salt. And if I have dry sodium chloride and it's a salt, have you ever seen those big salt crystals or those big salt licks? You could have you could even make salt into rocks, right, which are hard and they're like impossible to pry apart with your fingers, right? They're hard. I mean, you throw the salt across the room and damage the wall, right? That's tough. Those ionic bonds are holding the sodium cation and the chloride anion together really hard, right? That's hard. That's a strong bond. But what happens when you put that same salt crystal into water? Does it stay a crystal for long? No, because remember, the water molecules, they can dissolve salt. Remember, because water can stick to sodium cation with its partially negatively charged oxygens. Water can stick to chloride anion with its partially positively charged hydrogens. So water dissolves salt. So is this big, strong, scary ionic bond all that tough when it comes to water? No. And biology is the study of life, correct? And life is based on what fundamental unit? A cell. A cell. And what are your cells full of? Your cells are mainly water, right? Most of the weight of your cells is water. So everything that's happening in your body is happening in the presence of water. Does that make sense? So ionic bonds are weak in the presence of water because water dissolves them, okay? But ionic bonds are strong in the absence of water, like a salt crystal. So this is why your chemistry textbook may say that ionic bonds are strong while your biology text would say they're weak. All right, now to finish off the slides for this chapter and wrap it up. Remember, we talked about ionic bonds where atoms sometimes strip electrons from their bonding partners, kind of like how chlorine stripped an electron from sodium. The two resulting oppositely charged entities are called ions. The positively charged ion is called the cation. Negatively charged ion is called an anion. And anions and cations attract each other, forming an ionic bond, sort of like the compound salt, NaCl, table salt. And by the way, I told you about oxidation and reduction. I have a fun way to remember how oxidation and reduction work, the terminology I think of is Leo says Gur. That helps me to remember, believe it or not, and I'll tell you why. Leo would stand for loss of electron, means oxidation. Gur, it's like a lion would say gur. Gur is gain of electron, means reduction. So every time I think, what did oxidation mean? I just remember that Leo says gur. So lions say gur. And that helps me to remember. I hope that helps you too. So here, remember I showed you how sodium gets oxidized to sodium cation, while chlorine becomes reduced to chloride anion, and the cation and anion stick together and form an ionic bond, forming a compound known as sodium chloride, NaCl, table salt. And remember, compounds formed by ionic bonds are called ionic compounds or salts. This happens anytime the first group or first column meets the second last group or second last column. Salts, remember, are often found in nature as crystals. If they're dry, they are in crystalline form. If they are in aqueous environments, they're dissolved. NaCl itself is not a molecule. The formula for an ionic compound indicates the ratio of elements in the crystal of the salt. Most salts are quite stable when dry, but dissociate quite easily in water. We touched on that as well. So here you can see the crystalline structure of salt in a salt crystal. And remember, water can easily pick apart this crystal and bring it into solution. Now, the last concept of this chapter is chemical reactions, which include the making and breaking of chemical bonds. The starting molecules of a chemical reaction are called the reactants, and the resulting molecules of a chemical reaction are called the products. And so reactants appear on the left of the arrow. So here, hydrogen gas and oxygen gas are the reactants. And then they react. There's a chemical reaction where they rearrange their bonds to form water, two water molecules. So these are known as the products on the right side of the arrow. And chemical equilibrium is reached when the forward and reverse reactions occur at the same rate. So you would see an arrow going to the right and an arrow going to the left. Awesome. Well, we did it. We got to the end of the chapter. I know this was a long chapter, but I hope my explanations helped to shed light on chemistry for you and give you a better understanding of how these little atoms and elements work. Now let's move on to chapter 3, where we will discuss water and life.
Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. 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 Dr.